But the Wall Street Journal headline this morning, "Riots in China," and I promise you we had nothing to do with it. But we'll go into those issues as we move. First of all, a short video which will take us back to the days when Communist China was our mortal enemy, Governor Huntsman and Dr. Henry Kissinger. Fear and loathing of Communist China haunted America for a generation. The turning point was Japan's surrender in August 1945. The United States wanted the two dramatically different Chinese armies that had fought the Japanese to form a coalition and so avert a civil war. It would have taken a diplomatic genius to unite the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek with the communists under Mao Zedong. Too bad Henry Kissinger wasn't available. He was a 24-year-old soldier in the American Army. Ambassadors matter. President Roosevelt sent the wrong one. Ambassador Patrick Hurley, a Republican, was a former Oklahoma cowboy and oil speculator, given to venting ear-splitting Choctaw Indian war whoops. He was a brave soldier, but he knew nothing about China, and he misread both Chiang, whom he admired, and Mao, whom he disliked intensely. Privately, he called Mao Moose Dong. Mao's name for Hurley was Clown. Khrushchev said Mao Zedong was a master of concealing his true thoughts and intentions. Just look at those eyes. Mao's People's Liberation Army triumphed in September 1949.
And 1/4 of the world's population is brought under communist control.
Who lost China? Hurley did. But Democrats were blamed in every election thereafter. We kept China out of the United Nations. We spilt American blood and treasure in 2 wars, Korea and Vietnam.
Divide and encircle, conquer and enslave.
With our doctrinaire conviction that an expansionist nuclear China instigated them both as proxy wars in a sinister conspiracy contrived by their masters in the Kremlin.
Harmony between the Chinese dragon and the Russian bear.
Every presidency overrated the pull of Marxist ideology and underrated the force of nationalism. From Franklin Roosevelt to Truman, through to Eisenhower, through to Kennedy and Johnson, and vehemently into the ascent of the chief Red Scaremonger, Richard Nixon, elected the 37th president in 1969. Yet on February the 1st, 1969, we find this same Nixon changing the course of history by dictating into a tape recorder. Not one of the notorious Nixon tapes, but a note on a small personal tape recorder to a new staffer, Henry Kissinger, urging him to try and find a way of opening a door to China. Nixon had been quick to note rising tension between the Soviets and Chinese. Indeed, border fighting began just 3 weeks later. What risk the co-conspirators took? Risk of domestic fury. Americans were still dying in Vietnam. Risk of sacrificing Chiang Kai-shek's remnant nationalist hold-up in Taiwan. Risks in enraging the Soviet Union. Risks of failing to international humiliation. When a disguised Kissinger went off on his secret trip to Beijing via Pakistan in July 1971, he was meeting a negotiator as subtle as he was in Premier Zhou Enlai. And when he arranged for President Nixon to follow him on February the 21st, 1972, there was still no assurance that the president would meet the unpredictable Mao. But meet they did. It was a brilliant coup that transformed the structure of international politics. "This will shake the world," said Zhou Enlai when he and Kissinger agreed the communique. Kissinger closes his own new history on China with an aspiration. What a culmination if 40 years later, the United States and China could merge their efforts not to shape the world, but to build it. Henry, in the brilliant book he's written, ends it with that aspiration. So I'd like to ask him, how do you think we're doing to building a more fruitful world with the Chinese? And John, I'd like you to comment on it too. Are we making any progress? Because it seems to many people that the Chinese are getting more aggressive. And do we have any response that's worthwhile?
I think we understand what we would like to do. When the proposition that we should improve relations with China is recognized, and the same proposition is recognized in China. What we have not managed to do is to go from writing a communique on that subject to implementing it on a long-range basis. We do reasonably well on issues that arise. We do not do well in harmonizing the concepts of international order that in the long run will determine what the relationship will be.
John?
I think it's fair to say that here in the United States, we're very good short-term tactical thinkers. The Chinese are very good long-term strategic thinkers. It's how you bring these two different cultures together in order to better understand the intentions of each. I think that requires sustained dialogue. It requires the right kind of framework in which that dialogue can take place. But the reality today is that you've got two countries on the world stage. You have China and you have the United States. I don't think China anticipated that they would be sitting on the world stage quite this soon. I think in their own internal deliberations, they would have thought 10 or 20 years downstream. But because of the economic environment which we've all experienced the last several years, they're on the world stage. The question now becomes, are they ready to lead on the world stage? And I think there's a lag there. They'll figure it out, but I think there's probably 3 to 5 years during which they will have to come to grips with what it means to be on the world stage and to take a leadership and responsible role.
Do you think we've seen the end of Marxism as it was classically operated during the Cold War? Is Marxism any longer an influence? Yes, you can answer the question.
Is Mao still an influence? Mao's thinking?
Yes.
I think in the sense that he is respected for having unified China and for having put it on the world stage, he is an influence. In the long run, I believe there will be a debate between what was the Deng and the Mao view. That is, in the political transformations that will inevitably occur as a result of the growth of the economy. The question will be, do we do the things that work, or do we do the things that are infused by ideology? It will not take the form of Mao against Deng, but it will be the same debate that went on in the 60s and 70s, and that ended with Deng's view prevailing, that the practical should prevail over the purely ideological.
Do you see any remnants of Marx's ideology there, Ambassador? In the sense of it being wanting to unite the world under one ideological banner. Do the Chinese have any territorial ambitions beyond that? They obviously have ambitions in the South China Sea, but is there any ideological drive to make the world safe for communism?
No, I think their international forays are more based on economic pragmatism. I would say that Marxism, in the pure sense, may have died about 1978, 1979, when Deng Xiaoping said, "To get rich is glorious." So what did you find in 1972 that was so significant as a result of Dr. Kissinger's enormously important work and that of my great friend, Ambassador Winston Lord, who was also here, you found that Mao was able to put the Soviet Union in a different context, and probably by doing so brought some end to the Cultural Revolution, the beginning of the end. 1979, I think, was the other significant milestone, the formal recognition of China by the United States, which allowed Deng Xiaoping to begin what I would argue was a 3-decade journey, at least ideologically. And that was to promote pragmatic economics. We'll trade with whomever wants to trade with us, so long as they adhere to a one China policy. Also, launching a sense of rigidity within the Communist Party of China, and that is the primacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Third, I would argue that there was a sense of a very pragmatic foreign policy that he launched, all in the late 1970s. What is significant here, and it's less ideological, is that China today really is at the end of an era. It's at the end of the Deng Xiaoping era. What Deng set in motion 3 decades ago is just ending now with Hu Jintao, who was the last Deng Xiaoping appointment. And there's a very real question as to what the future will then hold for China's foreign policy.
There's a fascinating passage in Henry's book on China when he negotiates with Deng on the release or the safe passage for a Tiananmen Square objector who's hiding in the American embassy. I'd like to get your view of this because it illustrates the difference, I think, in a way. The Americans have a value system, they're missionaries. This is from Henry's book. The Chinese don't have that kind of missionary complex, so I read. So how difficult, what was it like negotiating with Deng, this very, very crucial issue which was driving people crazy in the United States?
Well, let me make a point about the previous issue of Chinese military expansion or Chinese imperialism. The Chinese believe that their values are universal, but you cannot become a Chinese by conversion. Americans believe that our values can be applied all over the world. So the Chinese form of expansion, it's by osmosis. It is not by military measures, except in.
What about the South China Seas? And
South China Sea is in the immediate defense of China. It is more militarily aggressive. Now, the notion of the Chinese impact on other countries is based on respect. Now, they will vindicate their perception of respect as they did in 1979 against Vietnam, when they attacked Vietnam in order to teach Vietnam a lesson, and devastated 3 northern provinces of Vietnam and then returned to their border. So one has to understand that the Chinese influence around the world will not be based primarily on military power, though they will back it up by military power in necessity. Now, in talking to Deng about this particular, about the dissident who was given asylum in the American embassy, the perception that those of us who had dealt with Deng was that brutal as the suppression of Tiananmen was, we remembered the China of Mao and we remembered the reforms that Deng had brought about. So we thought that Deng would want to come back and stated that he wanted to come back to his reform program. There was, of course, a constant dispute in the United States. Should one do this by confrontation or by engagement? And there is a place for each of those. But those of us who had access to Deng found that engagement could have some practical
If you
consequences.
had, just in terms of diplomacy, and I'm sure John is interested in this, how did you talk to Deng to get that hostage safely back to the United States? Because he wanted him released to be punished. How did you talk to him? Just imagine you were talking to Deng. I pretend to be Deng, or John possibly.
Deng was extremely interested in improving relations with the United States. I took the position in that particular conversation, which is covered in the book, that this was a practical problem, that for the United States, the presence of this dissident in the American embassy was a symbol of what affected the American perception of the crisis, of the Tiananmen crisis. And then Deng actually took the initiative to say what practically can be done to take care of my problem. He wanted a confession that the dissident would write a confession and that they would then pardon him and expel him. I told him that this couldn't be done and that nobody would believe such a thing. I've now found in the New York Review of Books that our ambassador asked Fang to write a confession, a meaningless confession. I was not in government at the time. It was not my view, and I don't know whether he was authorized from Washington to do it. In the end, I think he wrote one, but the key issue is that it was Deng dealt with that particular issue as a practical problem. I knew that he wanted to improve relations with the United States, and in the event the deal was not made, the outline of the deal was arranged when I was there, but then the Soviet Union collapsed, and there were 6 months of other negotiations that finally culminated.
Let me ask you both a question, John, to you. Since, as Henry argues in his book very well, I think, the United States, with its missionary to spread its values around the world, and with China looking to its cultural heritage and also wishing to reclaim its lost lands, purely in terms of democracy, isn't there bound to be an inevitable conflict between these two philosophies? What do you think? I mean, is it going to be possible to reconcile defending and exporting American values with the Chinese defending theirs? Should we desist? What should we do? You've been very active because you've been walking among, in fact, quite recently, you were asked what you were doing at a demonstrators meeting. What were you doing at a demonstration? You're the adjunct prop man.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Kissinger for the work he did in opening this relationship, because from it, we were able to adopt a lovely girl, Gracie May, who's sitting right over here. And we were taking a little stroll with Gracie and the family on a Sunday afternoon and stumbled across the Wang Fujing neighborhood, which is a neighborhood in which we would often find ourselves. And being a very curious State Department note taker, I wanted to take some notes. And I heard about it thereafter. But I would tell you that, we're never going to reconcile our differences. They're going to come some distance. We'll go some distance to accommodate them. But I think what is important longer term isn't that we begin to resemble each other in terms of our worldview. It's that we have the ability to discuss our longer term aspirations, our hopes, and our interests. We don't have the right mechanism yet in place today to be able to do that. And I would argue that until such time as we fashion something that is driven by the heads of state in regular consultation, the ability to review our aspirations, their aspirations, and develop some sort of overlay with respect to the shared interests, we're going to have a fairly unpredictable ride.
Well, at the moment, a considerable source of tension came through in a Reuters investigative story about now the rampant spying that China's doing on State Department documents, electronic spying, much more sinister and subtle than putting a microphone in a chandelier. which is now going on, and also spying against commercial interests. How can we resolve that? I mean, we believe in free competition, but do we believe in free spying? How much spying are we doing? How much spying did you encourage?
I don't know. I can talk about it.
But you mean your lips are sealed?
But you have to assume that both sides have a substantial spying capability. And it's a very difficult subject to discuss in the abstract. But it is a classical subject of what the ambassador was talking about, because it's really no way to solve it except by some kind of understanding of limitations. Because if you take it case by case, it will lead to accusations and counter-accusations. But how to arrange a cyber agreement, and even to define what the specific dangers are, because that might constitute an admission of capabilities, and then to define what the limitations might be. But that is the sort of challenge with a 5-year perspective, say, that absolutely needs to guide our relationship over a period.
Are we doing that? I mean, if you were president, say, would you ask Henry Kissinger to go and sort it out?
This has been, and it isn't about finding the right personality or individual. It's about establishing a framework, and this has been the most elusive part of the relationship. And I would liken it to 3 or 4 other key topic areas: missile defense, space, nuclear weapons, cyberspace, cybersecurity. These are issues that are very hard to get traction on. Dr. Kissinger is absolutely right. First of all, we must understand the extent of the cyber intrusions. I don't think we have any idea how deep and how wide in the extent of the penetrations, public and private sectors both. 2, we've got to develop a technical capability in terms of countermeasures, which to my mind is a huge opportunity for brilliant entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley to be able to put to work some good brain power. 3, at some point, we're going to have to develop a context in which we can actually discuss this. And I would think draw some red lines around areas that we don't want them into and they might not want us into. The rules of the road, if you will. I think if we somehow are able to bring together those 3 elements in a context that would allow us to reach 5, 10 years into the future, understand a little bit better our respective capabilities as we take them to strategic command, as they take us to second artillery, and we better understand some of their nuclear capabilities, it seems logical that this would be one of those big 4 or 5 issues that we need to better understand where each other is coming from.
In Henry's brilliant history, you actually keep emphasizing the importance of history to China, China's history, Chinese culture, and the past meeting the present. How can we get through issues like this, or the South China Seas? What can we draw from Chinese culture and Chinese history so we understand? I mean, how do they see the world? How do they see the world?
Well, for them, history is still a part of the present. For one thing, they don't see themselves as a rising power, as they always describe. They see themselves as returning to the traditional position in which China was the dominant country in the region. And for 18 of the last 20 centuries, China had the dominant GDP in the world. So there's this difference in perception. And for example, there's so many examples one can give, but when Mao decided to open, that he had to consider opening towards the United States, he brought 4 marshals back from working in factories into which he had exiled them after purging them, and asked them to write a paper about the future challenges of China. And they wrote that, in effect, that he had to open to the United States. So then the question was, how do we explain this to Mao, who had been castigating the United States? as the major enemy. One of them said, tell him it's like the Hitler-Stalin pact. Another one said, this won't work. He said, tell him it's like a chapter in the novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, that was written 600 years earlier, that described a situation that had happened 500 years before that, a book that was banned in China, but that they were sure that Mao had read many times. And that was an illustration that they felt Mao would grasp immediately. And so when we lecture China, it is often put by them into the framework of their 19th century experiences. But I want to underline a point that the ambassador made. It's not something we can do alone. They have to make their own adjustments in their own thinking. And the initial point which we discussed is that Americans look at problems in terms of solutions, and they believe that every problem has a solution in a finite time. Chinese think every solution is an admissions ticket for another set of problems, and that it is therefore has to be seen in the context. There's a Chinese word for it which I can't pronounce, which is something like "shi," which means the confluence of forces that assemble, "shi," that produce a momentum behind a situation, and they consider the essence of strategic wisdom to grasp that confluence like water running down a hill, and this is the way they would tend to look at problems, while we try to segment them into individual. But I think one reason why the initial discussions with China were relatively successful was that after 25 years of isolation, there were no concrete problems to discuss. So we were forced to discuss conceptual problems. Where do we want to go? Where are we likely to be? How do we assess the world? And since in foreign policy, one of the toughest problems is how you react to unexpected situations, if you can form an assessment of how the other side interprets things, you're part of the way to an understanding.
Mm-hmm. What's that word, Winston or Schuyler? Shooten. What's the word for the waterfall, the confluence? What?
Sure.
Okay, can you all hear that? Remember, you're going to need
it.
it.
The German version of
what?
it.
Make sure you get it right. If you don't, get a lesson from Winston or Schuyler. Okay. The ambassador was rather busy, I think. The turning from the cyber warfare, which is actually
no Chinese.
the cyber warfare which is going on now as we speak, there is this ominous scene in which Vietnam is tensing up against China because of the Chinese stopping the exploration in the South China Sea. The Philippines feel the same. Is this a temptation for the United States to actually side with the countries that are being basically oppressed or frightened or intimidated by China and form a new alliance against the Chinese to protect these countries? Or do we let them roll over in the face of a very forceful Chinese aggression? Ambassador.
I think it's an enormously powerful opportunity for us to shore up our ties with the ASEAN world, the 10 countries of ASEAN. Only a few of them have claims in the South China Sea. But ASEAN as a bloc is one of our largest trading partners. They long have felt that we have paid them insufficient attention. They're now staring down a future in which China would like to solve the South China Sea claims on a bilateral basis, one by one. Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, they're scared to death. It gives us an opportunity to help backstop them through multilateral problem solving, through ASEAN as an institution. They couldn't do it without some sort of legitimate backstopping by the United States.
Would you go along with the backstop, Dr. Kissinger?
I agree with the objective. the challenge will be to establish these relationships with these countries, many of which are really fairly strong, but to do it in a way that it does not look like a military containment policy. And so we have to do a complex policy. We need to be close enough to China so that we are partners with China on a whole range of problems. Simultaneously, we have to do this in South Asia, and if we are lucky and do it well, we will do it together in something like a Pacific structure, Pacific community, so it is not done on a confrontational basis. Because otherwise, each of these countries will be constantly torn between its fears and its other options. And so we have to simultaneously maintain a cooperative relationship with China, a cooperative relationship with South Asia in a sense that objectively backstops them, and then keep this from turning into a military confrontation. And it's a unique task. It's not often been accomplished.
How far would in your book, there's a brilliant description of how the West likes to play chess, which gets to a conclusion with a number of pieces and the king is dead. And the Chinese have a game called Go or Wei, where they bring pieces off and on, and they're looking for encirclement. Won't they feel that this kind of ASEAN policy is really stealing their clothes in a way which will alarm them?
It depends in part on what our China policy is simultaneously. If we maintain a strong China policy, this is the paradox, we can also maintain a strong ASEAN policy. While if we are in a posture of confrontation with China, then in every ASEAN country, the issue of the American relationship will become a domestic issue, and it could go in any direction.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, and this comes now, John, you have some recent information from China. The elections next year, there's going to be a new leadership. The princelings are what they're called. Which horse should we be backing to hope this kind of amicable cooperation that you mentioned? Should we fear Bo? Who should we back? Who is the most likely princeling to be a shoe on lie meeting a Henry Kissinger? John?
It's fluid and it's in flux today. Let me just say that the 18th Party Congress, the leadership changes around the 18th Party Congress will be unprecedented. You have to stop and consider the point that probably 60 to 70% of the top 200 positions, that's the Central Committee, that's the Standing Committee of the Politburo, that's the Central Military Commission, will turn over. I can't think of an analogous time, maybe Winston can, in history where there's been such sweeping change in leadership. We do know that Xi Jinping will be elevated from vice president to head of party and president of China. We do think that Li Keqiang, now the senior executive vice premier, will be elevated to the premiership. He's more of a technocrat. Xi Jinping I would describe as being a very adroit political operator. Anyone who can survive as the front runner for the last 2 years, working all of the elements of power that one must work in order to be successful, is quite adroit at politics. That would suggest that he's good at working the military, and we remember that he was once a misu, he was once an assistant to a former Ministry of Defense. It means that he's been adroit at working the 75 million members of the party, and it means that he's been able to draw from his relationships and even some of his earlier enemies within the princeling community. So it was very telling when Xi Jinping took what I thought was a very political trip down to Chongqing, right outside of Sichuan last December, to visit his former nemesis, Bo Xilai, who was the party secretary in Chongqing. Both different factions during the Cultural Revolution, both princelings, both very, very powerful in today's China. They came together last December, and at least to my eyes, it was a very powerful political symbol a patching up of their differences, so to speak, perhaps even a word of confidence that Bo Xilai would indeed be elevated to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and that they would be better off working together than apart. So when you're keeping your eye on the newcomers, I would say that there are likely 3 or 4 party secretaries running major municipalities, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Chongqing, who we should keep our eye on. I do believe that Bo Xilai, who I do know, is one of the more impressive of his generation. And if he is lucky enough to be elevated to the Standing Committee of the Politburo, given his view of the United States, given his warmth toward the United States, given his familial ties to the United States, given his willingness to do more business with the United States, he's known in Chongqing as an economic development success. He has an open door policy. I've been down to visit a couple of American investments there, and I asked one of them, a very large, well-known company, why are you here in Chongqing as opposed to Shanghai or Guangzhou? They said, one reason, Bo Xilai. He invited us, he opened his door, he's helped work us through the obstacle course of regulations, and we're succeeding.
May I say one thing?
Yes, go on, Henry.
We should understand it as the ambassador has described, but we should stay absolutely out of it. We will not be able to identify all the players. We will not know how to support them. We may have our private preferences, but our basic position should be that we are prepared to work with any of them. They will have to sort this out in the convoluted way in which they maneuver, and in which some of them will obviously make wrong judgments. So our judgments are not likely to be better than those of the losers in the party struggle.
Okay.
How
different are the... When you went there in 1972, and you've been 50 times since, the centers of power when you went were clearly Mao Zedong, with Chu Enlai going along with him. What are the centers of power in China? There's the PLA. It's in tension with the foreign ministry, is it not? I mean, where are the power centers lie? The real power centers. I'm assuming that the people aren't a power center. Pro-democracy doesn't count. Is that right?
I would argue you talk about the smoke and mirrors, the behind-the-scenes maneuvering by the party elders and the various factions of the military, the party, and the princeling community. I would argue that the elevation of leaders today is more transparent than before. Why? Because people are able to identify them, report on them, blog about them. A lot more is known about a Bo Xilai.
But you've been blogging in China.
Well, everybody does. Everybody does. It's a game to see if you can actually jump the firewall from time to time.
We should keep in touch with all the groups we can identify.
Let's ask some questions.
And we're not going to know, to be sure, until the very end.
All right. Anybody who can pronounce that word can speak first, but I'd like Winston Lord, actually. Winston, quick commentary. Winston was on the secret trip and actually played table tennis there, right?
I'm not at your level of table tennis. We're rightly celebrating Henry's book today for its brilliance and its farsightedness. I think we should also celebrate him for its brevity. He's gotten this down to 600 pages. And he used to spend 600 pages on a day at Harvard. So we can't say about his book what Ted Sorensen used to say about another author. Once you put down one of Henry's books, you can't pick it up.
Okay, but so where do you differ, or where do you emphasize?
A few nuances on top of what...
Give us a nuance.
Discussion. First, on the leadership succession, I think we would agree that it's collective leadership now, essentially. You don't have Mao running things, you don't have Deng running things. You got more collective under Jiang Zemin and even more so under Hu Jintao. Secondly, we're lousy at predicting what the leaders are going to look like. Who would have thought Mao would open to us? Everyone thought Jiang Zemin was a buffoon and he was quite effective. And everyone thought Hu Jintao might be liberal on political questions since he was close to Hu Yabang and head of the party school studying these issues, and they've gone backwards on that. Secondly, you asked early in this discussion about whether Marxism is dead. It is in the economic field, but Leninism is still very much alive in the political field. And that's the big question facing China. They're searching for values to go along with making money. And they've turned to nationalism and now, to a certain extent, Confucianism. But the big question, and by the way, Baudrillard is going back to Mao and some of his values. It's not just making money. The question is that they're going to be able to reconcile their political system, which is repressive, with the opening on the economic side. Final point I make, when we talk about the rise of China, we really ought to talk about the rise of Asia generally.
Right.
And Henry does this in his book. It's both the challenge and the opportunity. We're talking about India, we're talking about Korea, Southeast Asia, I wouldn't count out Japan. And we have tremendous assets because all of those countries have historical and territorial disputes, and they welcome the far barbarian to balance the close-in ones. So I think we should be confident about our future in the region.
Okay, and don't answer now. Just save it up. I want to go to the next question. Jamie Rubin, a diplomat once. Pardon? Is it give him a microphone? Identify and be brief.
Jamie Rubin. The economic research suggests there is a limit to how far China can grow without making the political changes. In other words, South Korea being an example was authoritarian, reached a certain level of economic growth, but then could not break into the genuinely rich countries until it made democratic changes. Do you, either of you, both of you, believe that would apply to China as well? And if so, what are the implications?
Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to, we're going to continue, but I just wanted to put a question to, I know people are wanting to ask this question. When are you going to declare you're going to run for president?
Is anybody listening to this broadcast?
No, there's only a few hangers-on here.
Well, since we're in select company and there aren't a lot of people listening in, I intend to announce that I will be a candidate for the presidency a week from today.
Hey!
My family looks shocked and surprised.
I
Of
know.
course they are. I hadn't told them yet.
Get him on the campaign trail. Get Henry on the campaign trail. Well, there you've heard it. So from now, those people who were sitting on the edge of their seat, you can ask a question about China. Yes, sir. Over there, sir. This young man. Identify. Oh, this young man here. They're all young.
Bill White.
Identify.
Bill White. Before I ask the question, quick PSA. It is the 236th birthday of the United States Army. We have a lieutenant colonel here, and we have the greatest military in the world. And it's a military-related question. The first time the American counterpart to Admiral Mullen met with the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was last week. It was 8 years since the last meeting. If you think those meetings are important, do you think we should try to push to have those meetings more often, given the global challenges of terrorism, cyber terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and other issues where they should be in communication?
Right, very good. Let's keep it up. We're going to put these questions together at the end. Mr. Tereshuk over there. Brief.
I have a question for Dr. Kissinger, I think, but maybe the ambassador would like to comment too. It's kind of a basic question, even maybe crude, in that it assumes, like, I think a lot of practitioners of realistic foreign policy would say that international relations are a zero-sum game in the end. But Dr. Kissinger, towards the latter end of your book, you bring up the famous Crow Memorandum from the British Foreign Office back in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Brits were really concerned about the spread of German power. And the memorandum says very clearly that it is inevitable that Germany will seek to increase its power and influence, and that will be at the expense of its rivals. And in your book, you were talking about how relevant or not that might be to the current situation, substituting China for Germany, of course, and the United States for Britain. I mean, is it inevitable that as China grows, America just loses its primacy, or even, dare I say, its indispensability?
Well, save it up. I made a note of it.
There, we've got one at the back.
One at the back? Yes, speak up.
Thank you very much. Jeff Mason with Reuters. My question is first on China. Specifically, you mentioned cybersecurity today. Do you think that this issue should be brought up at a forum like the G20 or where do you think that discussion on the 5 points that you mentioned should be had? And second, a political one for you, Ambassador. After your announcement today, can you tell us how you expect your background in China to differentiate yourself from other candidates in the Republican field?
Thank you. We'll probably have one more question, or maybe two. Is there anybody else here? Yes, this young man. Mr. Zuckerman? Or Peggy Noonan? Are you fighting over the microphone?
No, hi.
Leslie Stahl.
Hi, Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes. I'm curious about how stable China is. They have a demographic time bomb with so many more men than women because of their abortion policies. I'm curious how you think that's going to play out in the next 4 years and how serious the instability is within the country.
Very good. I'm going to get to all these points. Yes, sir.
My name is Mort Zuckerman. My question sort of feeds off of what Leslie was referring to. We seem to have this image of China, this sort of irresistible force. What do you think are the major weaknesses in that society now that might come up in the next 5 to 10 years that might affect not only their domestic policy but their foreign policy?
Okay, I think we might start answering these questions. Would you, right? Because there's been an accumulation here. Let's deal with the point from Leslie Stahl. Is it a stable society? We see there are pro-demonstration movements, unrest in 3 towns today. Is this a sign of some kind of irredentism in China? Either of you?
I think there's enormous insecurity internally today. When we look at China, we see the second largest economy. We see the largest emitter. We see reserves of $3 trillion in the central bank, so on and so forth. When they look inward at their country, they see gaps in income disparities. They see 700 million peasants. They see 100,000 demonstrations per year playing out. They see 500 million internet users and 80 million bloggers, wondering how on earth they're going to stay on top of the messaging that this creates throughout the country. So I would argue that one statistic really does tell it all, and that is when you look at spending last year for the Ministry of Public Security and the Ministry of State Security versus the Ministry of Defense, more was spent on domestic security than on defense. $90 billion roughly on their domestic security needs. That should tell you who they fear most these days. And I do believe that, just getting back to Ambassador Lord's comment about figuring out some way of melding values into this relationship, I would tell you that longer term, there will be a need for the regime to embrace a bilateral relationship based not only on shared interests, which we've done very well for 40 years. We trade, we invest, we send people back and forth, but somehow infusing shared values into that relationship as well. Political reform, the importance of the internet in society, so on and so forth. And I do believe that the years ahead, the next 3 to 4 years, are going to be rocky years in this relationship.
So does that answer Mort Zuckerman's question? What are the weaknesses? Dr. Kissinger, do you have a comment on that? Mort asked, what are the weaknesses?
Well, you have to add one other problem China will face, which is demographic, that it is the most rapidly aging population in the world because of the one-child family, and starting in the latest 2030, this will affect China in a fundamental way. I would express one warning, though, on the subject. We can observe this, we can study it, we can draw conclusions from it, but we should not talk as if we can shape the nature of Chinese domestic evolution by lectures to the Chinese. If we can build the relationship that the ambassador and I were talking about, it will be possible to infuse a tacit kind of influence into it. But the belief that we know the answer to the political evolution and can affect it. But by direct pressure and direct strictures, it's going to backfire and lead to the opposite result. And it's the time to answer the question on realism.
Yes, please.
First of all, I'm grateful that you used the word realism and not realpolitik, which is always used, so then say it's a German word, so you don't have to deal with it anymore. What my view is on these matters is, of course, you have to understand the elements that compose international politics, which also include the values that people have, societies have. If you look at the history of stable international systems, they have had two elements: an element of equilibrium and an element of legitimacy. If you rely entirely on power, you get into calculations that are beyond the capacity of most statesmen, and you lose the moral support. If you rely entirely on legitimacy, you get into crusades, which historically have killed more people than balance of power. So how to balance the element of legitimacy against the element of power, it's what I understand to be the crucial element in the international system. In that, our relationship with China, since we are the strongest nations, is crucial. And in understanding each other, we have to take into account how this is interpreted. I personally believe, as the ambassador has already pointed out, that the evolution of the Chinese economy, the movement of people from the villages into the cities, is going to bring about a change in the way political power is perceived. And it is something we need to understand and act towards, but we cannot directly affect it by American proclamations. But we also cannot ignore it. So this will be the fundamental challenge, in my view, that we face over the next decade.
Does that answer the air crow point you mentioned about Germany and...
Oh, Germany and Britain. Yes, Germany and Britain. Well, first of all, it took an extraordinarily foolish German policy to bring matters to the point of that memorandum that I cite. When Germany already had the largest land army, that it was also building the largest navy, or not the largest navy, but a navy strong enough to threaten the British Navy. That could not be achieved without confrontation. So one doesn't know whether a policy of greater restraint, especially on the part of Germany, might not have led to a different result. Secondly, had the readers of the Crow Memorandum known what, which was sort of conventional wisdom, had they known what the world would look like the year after the end of the First World War, would they not have taken another look at the inevitability of confrontation? We not only know what the world will look like after such a confrontation, we also know this whole array of issues that the ambassador and I mentioned at the beginning that can only be dealt with on a global basis and cannot be dealt with on a competitive basis.
Very good.
And therefore, I believe the seeming inevitability of a rising power and a status quo power presents problems, but can perhaps for the first time in history be overcome.
At the military point, you wanted the generals to meet. Yes, I have a quick answer on that because I got one more question. He was arguing that there should be military top-level meetings, right?
There is currently a gaping hole in the bilateral relationship, and that is the military-to-military component. It seems to rise and fall based upon certain externalities like arms sales to Taiwan. It's the easiest aspect of the relationship to cut loose. But what does it do in the meantime? All the while, the PLA becoming a little more assertive and confident, and no guarantee that they are plugged in terms of their strategic decision-making with the political side of Zhongnanhai. We must make the military-to-military relationship work, starting with some sort of maritime consultative discussion because of their activities in the South China Sea and East Asia, and because of ours. And if there's one thing that should keep any ambassador awake at night, and Winlord I'm sure had his moments, it's that we are doing our thing and they are doing their thing in sensitive waters and territories, some in dispute, without any kind of overarching framework in which a protocol, a communication protocol would then play out. This must be done. The military-to-military junior officer exchanges, senior officer exchanges. You can begin with the marching bands. You can begin with educational opportunities. It's slow to start, slow to get off the start, but this is, I think, a critically important part longer term for the success of the bilateral relationship, simply because the nature of our military, and I must tell you, my son just enlisted with the Navy today, so I'm thinking about this very thing, is to, there's suspicion generated in the respective military cultures toward one another, and unless you have some way to diffuse that through dialogue, through interaction, it grows worse over time, and sadly, that's where we are today.
Right. You've got 30 seconds to say how your relationship with China is going to help you get to the White House. That was what was asked.
Well, I would have to tell you whether or not Dr. Kissinger agrees. I could cite chapter and verse on how improvements are made in the bilateral relationship, but to my mind, the single most improvement we could make in the U.S. China relationship would happen right here at home, and that's getting our own house in order, because as we have a very weak economic core, right, we are less able to project the goodness and the power and the might of the United States. We sit diminished and discounted at the negotiating table, and everybody knows that. Right. So if you want a strong U.S.-China relationship, I would argue that we probably have a little bit of work here in our own backyard.
Very good. Well, we're going to close now. I just wanted to, but just before you go, I just wanted to bring you back to Henry's book and a kind of rather chilling note he strikes at the end. When Henry was a young man, he did an absolutely brilliant paper on Immanuel Kant of the categorical imperative. And one of Kant's saying was that we'll get to a universal peace either through human insight or by a catastrophe of such a magnitude that leaves humanity no other choice. Are you ready? And the Henry Hen says this: we are now at such a juncture. Well, thank you very much indeed for enlightening us.
Hi, I'm Steve Adler. I want to thank you all for being here and thank our panelists. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights with us. Presidential candidate Huntsman, we can call you that now for the first time. Thank you very much both for making news here and for being our guest. And I want to especially thank Harry Evans, who is, you may have seen yesterday, it was announced he'll be Reuters editor-at-large. And when that was announced in our newsroom yesterday, I got a lot of emails. And the gist of most of the emails was, I'm really honored to be working in the same newsroom as Harry Evans. And that was my reaction as well. So thank you, Harry, for joining us.
Thank you, Harry.